May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. So I always get this wrong, World Aboriginal Day of Prayer, or something that sounds similar to that today. And it's, so I wanted to preach a bit on the gospel. This was the gospel that was assigned for the day. And some of the things we learned as Canadians in response to the gospel and as Christians in response to the gospel in the 21st century. There's an expression, drawing the circle wider. It's used every once in a while for different things, usually around compromise. Something that we don't really realize as Canadians is the effect that and the amount that we as a culture and as a nation have been shaped by our relationships with the Aboriginal people that were in Canada for thousands and thousands of years. Perhaps the most remarkable, or one of the most remarkable things, was the fact that there were 100,000 languages spoken in North America. 100,000 languages when the Europeans first arrived. I think many of us might have some sort of, we're under the misunderstanding that there were there weren't that many tribes, or perhaps that the Iroquois Confederacy had already existed, not in response to England and the United States and all the rest of it. But the reality was this was an incredibly, incredibly diverse place. And if you compare the history of this place for the past thousands of years or 10,000s of years, it is very different from Europe, right? Europe also had a vast array of tribes, right? We were just learning about a lot of these tribes in the early Middle Ages course. There were all kinds of tribes of all different, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and there's a bunch. And over the course of European history and the history of the Middle Ages, these tribes went to war and fought and fought and fought over and over again until eventually most of the cultures were condensed down to a very small group that we would describe as nations, right? These very focused tribes. So you have the French, right? Not Burgundians, not all the various, tribes in the Frankish area, but France and Spain and Italy. But that did not happen in North America in the same time. A lot of these tribes and communities coexisted. Absolutely, there was still war in North America. There was still violence. They weren't entirely peaceful. But there's a dramatic contrast between the way that the tribes of North America compromised and got along and the way the tribes in Europe compromised and got along. Very different. Europe liked to use borders. It settled things with language and very specific cultural barriers. And in Canada, historically, it was compromising. It was if we were staunch European lords, we might see their compromise as wishy-washy or confusing or culturally ambiguous. But it was successful. It drew the circle wider to incorporate various tribes that you knew lived in your midst. And even though there wasn't a strict orthodoxy of what it meant to live in the Ottawa region, people could exist within a certain amount of peace. And that's how people lived. And so when we came as a nation, and when I say we, I say my European ancestors, there's inevitably going to be something politically incorrect that I say in this sermon because I'm just going to blunder through something stupid. So just ignore any of my ignorance in this area. When my ancestors, and possibly many of your ancestors, came to Canada, we had to learn a lot of that. And where it is amplified in Canada is the first settlers died. This is a lethal place to live. Especially, believe it or not, actually, there have been little climate change moments that have gone up and down. And when a lot of the early European settlers came, it was actually much colder on average than it was even in the last 100 years. It was actually freezing. It was very, very cold in Europe as well as in Canada. And the first settlers all died. And whereas the United States they could start building quasi-European settlements and start to build cities and roads, our roads were canoe routes, right? We didn't have dynamite. There was no way to build a road into the interior of Canada. We had to learn how to canoe. We had to learn, and of course the cities, couldn't build the same kinds of cities. We couldn't eat the same kinds of foods. We couldn't grow the food we grew in Europe. So we ended up living a life that was very, very similar to all the Aboriginal communities that lived around us, and not only physically, but culturally. Right? We adapted their culture of compromise because we couldn't be European conquerors in a traditional sense because we were freezing to death. Right? It's fantastic. It's one of the reasons why we're so special and unique as a country. We think that we're like European Americans, but we're not really. Especially when it comes to this kind of stuff, when it comes to compromise, when it comes to our sense of not sticking to one tribal identity at the expense of all others, but rather letting people around us simply be. That is, in a lot of ways, uniquely Canadian. And what is exciting for me, and why I'm saying this in the pulpit, is because it shapes our theology as well. It shapes our identity as Christians. It makes us rather remarkable Christians and rather remarkable Anglicans that are not particularly obsessed with doctrinal purity in ways that you might find other Christians throughout the world much more interested and much more obsessed with what is doctrinally right, and should I fight you on that or not? We don't have those kinds of conversations very often as Canadian Christians. We want to know how to be at peace with those around us, and is there any conflict, and is there something that we can do about it? We're very big on compromise. It's wonderful to be a Canadian Christian. So I wanted to share that with you first because it's something that I think is exciting and something to celebrate. It's not so much a racial legacy, right? It's a very deep cultural and unique legacy that we all share as Canadians as a result of our relationship with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. A relationship that's very much alive. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to describe some of the more special and unique ways that this plays out. The idea of drawing the circle wider, how our theology is changing. One of the great shortcomings, you could argue, that Christians have been not particularly adept at handling is environmental crisis. We're not good at... We have an image of us being stewards of the earth, and unfortunately that's not the most rich or deep image. The problem that environmental Christians... Unfortunately, or fortunately for you, depending on perspective, I took a course on environmental theology, so I can now throw this stuff at you. One of the problems that environmental Christians have found is that to be a steward of the earth is there's a certain dominant character to it. It's like we're a benevolent gardener, where the earth is our possession, and we are sort of stewards of it. It can be a very, very rich image for some. For others, they feel, and we're starting to feel as creatures, that we're creatures. We are vulnerable like the rest of our environment. And what a lot of Christians are now thinking is perhaps we need to rethink the very essence of what it means when The gospel says that Jesus came to redeem the world. Historically, we had thought, when we thought the world, we thought the nations of people. Perhaps we need to go right back and think, what does it mean that Jesus came to redeem the world, all of creation, that creation is good, that we are redeemed, not just our souls, but our bodies? And what does that mean? This is something that's happening to us as people. We're rediscovering our bodies and our environment in ways that we haven't before. Think about how often in the news and in conversations talk about diet comes up. Think about how often and uncomfortably sexuality comes up in the pulpit of all places, right? Along with the news and everywhere else. Why is this coming up? Why are we talking about the environment increasingly? All of the physical things that it means to be people. When we're talking about mental health in a different way. We're not talking about people plagued with demons. We're talking about our minds being a part of our bodies. Something that can be sick. Just like our minds can be sick, just as our bodies can be sick. We're rediscovering that we're creatures. And that we're in an ecosystem. That our environment can be harmed. That forests are living things. That the oceans are living things, that we're dredging up the ocean floors. And it's really causing us as Christians to rethink when we talk about bringing in a diverse group of people to just be and to be with us and for us to be at peace. We're starting to think perhaps we should have the same attitude toward creation. How can we let the earth be? How can we be in the earth? How can we be in our bodies? How do we become comfortable with who we are? Not just our souls, but our bodies and our minds. How can we be at peace with these things? Even things like diet. People are talking about that everyone has an eating disorder. I heard that on CBC like last week. I don't know about that necessarily, but there is a sense that we're at war with our own diets. That no one seems to be happy with what they're eating. There's a sense of us trying and seeking out a way to be at peace in a wider sense than simply just cultural peace or peace over religion or peace over values. Right? So I want us to think about this. I'm still wrestling with this myself and what exactly it means for Jesus Christ to be the Redeemer of the world, meaning all creation, all humans. The cosmos, perhaps. I don't know if stars need our help as much as the oceans and rivers, but on World Aboriginal Day of Prayer, where we think as Christians about drawing the circle wider and about being at peace, I want us all to think about what it means to become at peace with ourselves, our bodies, our minds, and what it means to be at peace with creation. Amen.